Okay. So let's get started. So today's topic is going to be about long-term nicotine use. And with that, I'm going to talk a little bit about the health risks of long-term nicotine use and also give some practical guidance about helping people that might be on long-term NRT to quit. So I've already done this already, and again, if you've got questions, if you can just use your message function, that would be great. And we'll go back at the end and answer some of those questions. So always good to start with disclosures. So I've got different roles, different jobs, and today I'm in my role working as part of the National Training Service. Now, if we just start with looking at some of the trajectories for people who smoke, and what we're really aiming to do is to get people off combustible tobacco, so get them to stop smoking, and ideally they wouldn't be using nicotine long-term either. So that would be an ideal world. Now, we've got a whole lot of tobacco control policies and smoking cessation treatment that help do this and help shift people to that ideal goal. But as you all know, it doesn't always work like that in the ideal setting. And so some people are going to need to use nicotine use for a period of time before they finally manage to cease both smoking and nicotine use. But there are some, and I think these are especially those that are really highly dependent smokers, those with mental illness, for example, homeless people, they all typically fall into that category of very highly dependent smokers. These are the people that may need to use nicotine long term. Then we've got other scenarios where you'll have a mix of both combustible tobacco use, smoking, and nicotine use for some time. Now, we do this in smoking cessation treatment, of course, with our cut down then quit approach, or our pre-quit flexible quit date, where people are using both smoking and nicotine replacement therapy at the same time. Now, ideally, of course, we'll shift them to stop smoking completely and they'll be on nicotine for a period of time. Then they may go on to stop nicotine use completely, or they may need to use nicotine longer term. And I think we can't escape this issue either, which might be long-term dual use. And I think we're seeing a few more of these people recently, especially with price of tobacco going up, where you've maybe got people that are using patch or gum on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. They get their money income on Thursday, then they can buy their cigarettes and go back to smoking for a while. So that's how these things go sometimes. Now, just on the notion of nicotine, these are just some examples of tobacco control interventions, which I think have confused smokers a little bit in what the health risks of smoking actually are. And you can see on this poster that it's suggesting that nicotine's removed from your body, but then in other things you've got nicotine as a poison. And so it's sometimes difficult to get people to even use NRT long-term because they really worry about the health risks of nicotine. So I think we've got to be very clear here when we're looking at the toxicity of nicotine. Now, a few technical terms here, which I don't want you to get too tied up in, but you might have heard claims, or they're often something you see in some literature, that somewhere between 30 and 60 milligrams of nicotine is lethal for your average adult. Now, some of you probably know that people triple patch. There's 61 milligrams of nicotine already. Of course, it doesn't give you 61 milligrams of nicotine all at once. It's delivered slowly. But this has always seemed a little bit low to me. And indeed, a few years ago, a toxicologist traced this evidence back to some very dubious self-experiments in the 19th century, in Austria, where you had a couple of mad scientists that were giving themselves nicotine to try and work out what the lethal dose was, and just came up with this 60 milligram dose. That's not actually the case, and it's actually much greater than that. And you've really got to look at the I don't know where my pointer's gone here. Let me just see if I can get out of this. Can you see this now with my pointer on the screen? Yeah, okay. We might do it this way. So this is actually very, very low. And the lethal dose that we're really talking about in adults is somewhere between 6 and 12 milligrams per kilogram. So it's much, much more than we thought it was. So the nicotine that we get from tobacco, of course, is used by smokers, and smokers are very, very good at using, sorry, I'm just adjusting my screen size here, are very good at using nicotine. They're used to the high levels, and we've had very, very few cases of fatal poisoning. So I'm going to go back to full screen now. Okay, so what about nicotine safety in terms of nicotine replacement therapy? Well, first, short-term use. We've got loads of data to show that short-term NRT use is safe. It's safe for those with cardiovascular disease, it's safe for those that have lung disease, and even for pregnant women, it is safer than smoking. In terms of long-term NRT use, the evidence is much less. And over the years, there have been a number of concerns, and you might have seen this in some of the media reports, mainly around nicotine causing cancer. And this is a bit of a theoretical risk, I suppose, and it would be involved in a number of steps where you get this formation of carcinogens. And that example there of a carcinogen, although nicotine itself is not carcinogenic. So just giving someone nicotine, that's not carcinogenic, but under steps where it's degraded, broken down, then in theory, you could get some carcinogenic effects occurring, in theory. Now, we've got data from animal studies, and this is what you often see. And these animal studies suggest that nicotine might have a tumor promoting effect. Now, the theory here is that it might cause cancer cell proliferation or cancer cell growth. It might cause new blood vessels to grow. Now, these were in experiments where they took mice and they tied off or occluded their main arteries, like their arteries to their legs. And when they injected nicotine into these poor animals' muscles in their legs, it caused new blood vessels to grow. Now, when you've got new blood vessels growing and there might be a cancer cell close by, then those cancer cells could grow. There's also some research to suggest that nicotine might be involved in, that should say, decreased programmed cell death. So we've got a unique mechanism in our body where bad cells pretty much self-destruct. So that's called apoptosis. And it's thought that nicotine might interfere with that. So there's all these theories out there of how nicotine might have that adverse effect, especially in terms of cancer growth. But to summarize, the data come from lab studies or animal studies. And whatever happens in animals, apart from it being, in my view, cruel, doesn't necessarily translate to humans. Also, animal studies suggest that nicotine exposure for the fetus might have adverse effects on cognitive function. And you know that women who smoke in pregnancy are more likely to have babies that don't reach their full potential in terms of cognitive functioning. brain development, nicotine might have adverse effects on brain development in adolescent periods as well. But again, these are from animal data. And who knows what the relevance of these findings are to humans. So when you hear these things raised, you can say, look, I'm aware of this. I know that there have been animal studies that suggest that in theory there might be some adverse effects of nicotine. But in humans, this doesn't seem to be the case. Now, the best data we have at the moment comes from the lung health study. Now, in the study, they encouraged people to use nicotine chewing gum for as long as they needed. And they followed these smokers up for 7 years, and there were almost 6,000 people in this study. So smokers were just encouraged to use NRT for as much as they liked, for as long as they liked. And this study found no association at all between long-term NRT use and cancer or cardiovascular disease. Also, I think we've got to remember NRT, gum in particular, has been on the market for 40 years. It's been out there, it's in supermarkets, and no risk has emerged. So, you know, even if there was a risk of using NRT long-term, it'll be far outweighed by the risks of continued smoking. And I think we've got to remember here the comparator is not nothing. We're using NRT in people who smoke, and smoking has got such large, well-documented risks. NRT, even if there are risks, are so small, and I'll show you some data later on that it's unlikely to cause any harm. Now, just to illustrate this was a study published this year, quite a nice study where they took 5 groups of people. Each group had between 36 and 37 people, and they were either cigarette smokers or they were ex-smokers who were using e-cigarettes long-term, more than 6 months, or they were ex-smokers using NRT long-term for more than 6 months, or they were dual users. So they were both smoking and using e-cigarettes, or smoking and using NRT. Okay, so there were 5 groups of people, and the researchers collected saliva and urine and analyzed those for tobacco-related carcinogens and other toxicants. Okay, so they looked at a range of different toxicants in these people. Now, don't freak out by this table just yet. And I'm just going to go out of the screen so I can get my cursor back again. And I'm just going to explain what we're looking at here. Okay, so here are your groups. I haven't included the cigarette smokers here, okay, because all of these numbers here are compared to cigarette smokers. So compared to the urine and saliva of cigarette smokers. Okay, so here we have dual users, cigarettes and NRT, dual users, cigarettes and e-cigarettes, NRT only, and e-cigarette only. Now, the numbers you're looking at here are the percentage compared to smoking. Okay, so just as an example, so here's nicotine. If you were using cigarettes and NRT, you only had 64% of the nicotine compared to smokers. Okay, so if you were dual users of cigarettes and NRT, you had less nicotine than smoking. If you were dual users of smoking and e-cigarettes, you actually had more nicotine than smoking. If you were NRT only users, you actually had higher levels of nicotine than smoking. So it just goes to show, and just bear in mind that these long-term NRT users were your expert NRT users. Okay, they were really using it well, and they were getting good levels of nicotine out of that. And this is your e-cigarette only, so a bit less than what you would see with smoking. Now, so that's those first 2 lines are related to nicotine. NMK is a carcinogen. Okay, so it's one that's linked to lung cancer. And what you can see here on this slide, that if you're still smoking, these 2 groups, both with NRT and e-cigarette, they still had quite high levels of NNK, of this carcinogen. Okay, less than smoking, but still quite high. If you'd switched to NRT or e-cigarettes, this was much lower. Not zero, but significantly less. Interestingly, those using e-cigarettes here had even less exposure than nicotine replacement therapy does. Okay, so these, even with nicotine, because you're giving people nicotine, you can form NNK. Okay, so that's one of the things that you might see, but it's the dose that makes the poison, of course. So low dose doesn't necessarily mean harm. Now, all these other things on the tables are all have adverse effects. All of these are carcinogens here, and what you see typically is that they're lower when you're using NRT and e-cigarettes than smoking. So really, that's all you need to know there. Okay, so that's sometimes what people worry about is the health risks, and I think you can put aside those points, and again, saying compared to smoking, the risks of long-term NRT use are very, very low. The other question people might ask you, of course, is, well, am I going to get addicted to this stuff? Can NRT cause dependence? And I think there's a very obvious first point to start here, is that we're not actually creating a new dependence, because these people are smokers and are already addicted to nicotine. So you can reassure them about that. But the chances of long-term NRT use are related to the speed of absorption. Okay, so the faster the nicotine absorption, then the greater the chances of long-term use. Now, NRT typically really doesn't deliver nicotine very quickly. And even in non-smokers, you don't see long-term NRT use. Now, these data are from the UK, and I just want you to look at the bottom two lines, so the blue and the green solid lines. This is looking at long-term or current use of either NRT in the green line or e-cigarettes in the blue line in never smokers. Okay, so just to go again, so here is current use of e-cigarettes in never smokers and current use of NRT in never smokers. It does happen sometimes. You're not going to see these people because they're probably not going to come to your service, but there are the strange case of some people who have never smoked using NRT. Maybe to control weight would be perhaps a reason they might like to do this, or some people use it for a little bit of cognitive enhancement. But just coming back to my point about nicotine delivery, the slide is from the Royal College of Physicians and just gives you an idea of the different nicotine replacement or delivery by smoking. Sorry to just go back again, but here is the pharmacokinetic profile of smoking a single cigarette, okay, over time. Here is 4 milligram nicotine gum. Now, if you use 4 milligram nicotine gum really well, you can get quite high levels of nicotine from this. But you know, people have to use it pretty well to do so. But it's much slower. So you're reaching peak plasma concentration here somewhere between 20 and 30 minutes. Okay. Here is the 2 milligram gum. Here's the nicotine nasal spray as it was, so lower because it's quite aversive to use. And then you've got the patch. Now this little inset up here shows the difference between two different patch types. Here's the 24-hour patch, and here is the 16-hour patch. But overall, you get very similar blood nicotine levels. Some of the 21 milligram 24-hour patches are a little bit faster acting than the 16-hour. Okay, so you know these data already. Still nothing is as good as smoking. And remember that most NRT products, especially when people start using them, typically deliver less nicotine than they got from smoking. You can, as I showed you in that table a few slides ago, you can get up to smoking levels, but you have to use this really well. Okay. And again, just to reiterate the point, nicotine from NRT is considered harmless. Now, what about these beliefs about harm though? Well, actually, people do believe that long-term NRT use is harmful. Now, these data are from around 1,500 smokers, where over a quarter believed that long-term NRT use was quite harmful or very harmful. So we still haven't, corrected these misbeliefs, and you do need to address it. Almost 30% didn't even know. And the most commonly reported harms or fears that people have are addiction and lung cancer. So when you're talking to people about NRT, don't forget to say, look, this is not going to cause cancer. It's the products of combustion that cause the harm. And then you're probably going to have to address this issue of addiction. So remember, we're not creating a new addiction or a new dependence. Yes, we might be transferring it in some people, but most people won't use NRT long term. So these are the sort of points that I'd ask if someone said to me, look, great, I want to use the nicotine gum, but can I get hooked on this? So remember and say, look, it's a concern that many people have, but I'd like to reassure you that you're not going to get hooked. You're not going to develop a new dependence. You're already addicted to nicotine. That's in the tobacco smoke. And actually, very few people go on to get hooked on nicotine replacement therapy. And I say, look, relying on it for the first 12 weeks, absolutely fine, and actually shows that the treatment's working. There are some people that will use this longer than others. And they're, usually the really highly dependent smokers that might need that to stay smoke-free. And you know what? That's absolutely fine. And I'd like to reassure you that there are no health risks from using NRT long-term, and long-term use really means that that treatment was successful. So make sure that you address this up front, because it seems that most smokers worry about this still. So what is the right length of treatment? Well, as you guys all know, encouraging people to use it for at least 8 to 12 weeks is important. Most people don't use it even for that long. And if you think about this logically, if you've stopped smoking, why would you think that you need to carry on using a treatment? And indeed, that's what goes through most people's minds. So still a little bit of work around why you need the longer treatment. It can help prevent relapse. Overall, in the general population, there's actually little benefit in actively recommending NRT for longer than 6 months. So you wouldn't start out at the very beginning of treatment saying, I recommend that you should use this for a year, because there's no evidence to suggest that's any better than saying, I recommend that you use this for at least 8 to 12 weeks. But what you can say is, I want you to use it for as long as it takes until you feel comfortable in being smoke-free. So the decision to extend this should be done on a case-by-case basis. Now, what is the evidence of long-term NRT use? And these data are from our service in London when I was prescribing NRT for anyone up to a year. And we thought we'd better audit our data to see what was going on. So these data are from 1,500 consecutive clients attending our London Stop Smoking service who set a quit date and used NRT. And at 1 year follow-up, we found that 5% were still using NRT. So there you go. It's quite low overall. So when you're giving advice to people, you can say, look, most people, 95% of people are going to stop using NRT. Okay, but there are some that are going to use it long term. And when you looked at those who had not smoked a single puff over that whole year, actually around about a quarter of them were still using NRT, because, well, that's probably what was needed to help keep them smoke-free. And the proportions that were using NRT long-term differed by product. So nicotine nasal spray, we don't use that anymore, but nicotine mouth spray would be similar here because it's fast-acting. Around 13% were using the nasal spray for a year. the oral products, the gum, the lozenges, somewhere between 6 and 9%. And we had this strange case of about 2% of people using patches for a whole year. And I say strange because patches just aren't very, well, they're not fast nicotine delivery systems. So it was a bit odd that you'd have long-term patch users. Here's some more recent data. This is from the UK Stop Smoking Services, so much larger study, but they asked the same question. And among those that used NRT in their quit attempt, 6% were still using NRT the year. So very similar to our smaller sample in our London clinic. You can see the 95% confidence interval there. So you can assume that in real life, somewhere between 4 and 8% of people that start out using NRT would use it long term. So, you know, reassure people that that's okay. Use, of course, was higher in those that managed to stop smoking. Again, because these people are using it to help them quit. Okay, so that's to be expected. So long-term users, you can expect those that are most highly dependent, those that are smoking lots at baseline, they smoke within the first 30 minutes of after waking, they're your more highly dependent smokers, and they are more likely to use NRT long term. Those who smoke for withdrawal relief, so those that smoke just to keep withdrawal symptoms at bay, they're the ones that are more likely to use NRT long term. If you've got clients that are smoking to control their weight, you know, they're absolutely fearful that they're going to stop smoking and gain weight. And you know that using NRT can attenuate weight gain. So those that were smoking to control their weight are more likely to be long-term NRT users as well. And interestingly, people that have used NRT during previous quit attempts are more likely to be long-term users. But when you look at the overall profile, they're much closer to treatment failures, i.e., these people would not have succeeded in being smoke-free for a whole year without the long-term NRT use. This is the balance. It's weighing up the risks of stopping NRT use too soon and then relapsing to smoking. Now, just let me explain this here. It just goes back to my earlier point that it's your more highly dependent smokers that are using NRT long-term. And what this is showing you is that your baseline cigarette consumption, that's the x-axis down the bottom, the higher the number of cigarettes you smoked, up until around 25 cigarettes per day, the more likely you are to use more pieces of NRT per day longer term. So it's just another way of showing you that it's your highly dependent smokers that are more likely to use NRT and more of it longer term. So don't be surprised by that. Now, this whole long-term patch use, as I said, I was surprised by these because they should, in theory, have little chance of long-term NRT use because they don't give you any subjective effect. You're not putting anything in your mouth and giving a hot, peppery taste. There's no repeated behavior over the day. It's just, you know, slap a patch on, that's it. You forget about it, and it's quite slow nicotine delivery. But as I said, we had 2%. So 14 out of 719 were still using it a year. And when we talk to these people, it seemed just to be a sort of a safety blanket almost. I'm too scared to take it off because I'm worried about relapsing. So as opposed to perhaps the true need for the nicotine, it might have just been, I just need to have that patch on there to help me get through. So what do you do? And I know that you're going to be seeing more of these clients, especially some coming to us from Quitline, about this long-term NRT use. Well, I think the first thing you need to do is have a discussion around the risks of stopping versus continuing. Now, the risks of stopping NRT use are that withdrawal symptoms will come back. And of course, that's related to relapse to smoking. So we really need to find out if you do stop it or cut it back, what are the chances of them going back to smoking? because that's a much worse situation to be in than carrying on NRT use. Now, the risks of continuing NRT use, we've already covered off. There are no health risks, so you can put that aside. It's really coming down to a couple of things. One, your client resents feeling dependent. They don't want to be addicted to this nicotine anymore. You know, you'll get these people that saying, yeah, it was great, I was addicted to smoking, but now I'm addicted to this nicotine. And they don't like that, and they want to stop that. They want to get to a point where they're tobacco-free and nicotine-free. Now, although we provide subsidized NRT, there may be some people using nicotine mouth spray, for example, long-term. Now, they have to buy that, and so there will be a substantial cost involved in that. So that would be another risk, I suppose, of using NRT long-term. So trying to find out what's going on there. Now, in practical terms, that means that you're going to ask, how do you feel about your NRT use? They say, I really like it, it's really helpful, not worried about anything, and you can reassure them that that's right, there's no health risks, and we can continue to provide this. Then I'd suggest monitoring them on a regular basis. If they're coming back in to receive NRT, make sure you do their CO reading. Keep a record. Don't just hand out the box of gum and say, see you later. Have a quick chat to them. I periodically ask, how do you feel? Do you want to stop this? Do you want to keep on going? And have somewhere to document that in your clinical record. You might just need a register of long-term NRT users just so you can keep track of how they're getting on. Now, if they want to stop, let's say they don't want to be hooked on this anymore, or if they want to stop for financial reasons, then you can offer treatment, and I'll explain this. But during the treatment, it's really important to monitor their urges to smoke. And if they start getting too high, then you're better to return them to NRT for a while. You don't want them relapsing to smoking. Okay, so here's our 4-step NRT withdrawal program. Some of you have used this. It is not a magic cure. It can take many weeks to complete this 4-step withdrawal process. So there's no one size fits all. You just have to take it on a case-by-case basis. But let's say you have a client who's using 20 pieces of gum a day. So what you do with this person is you'd start them on the lowest strength patch, so the 7 milligram 24-hour patch, and you'd set a goal to halve the dose of oral NRT, so go from 20 pieces of gum a day to 10 pieces of gum a day over perhaps 4 weeks or so, or whatever they feel is a realistic goal, and you're going to monitor urges to smoke. Okay. Now, when they're comfortable and they've reached that 10 pieces of gum a day, and they say, yep, I've got here, this is fine now, I'm managing 10 bits a day, you're going to increase to a medium strength patch and then aim to halve the dose of gum again. So from 10 to 5 a day, and you're going to monitor urges to smoke, and you're going to set some goals, and they're going to slowly reduce their consumption over, again, probably another 4 weeks or so. So again, it's just about when they're comfortable. So they're down to 5 now. When they're comfortable, you're going to increase to the full strength patch and stop the gum altogether. Now, this is often the hardest step. There's a little bit of a leap of faith here, and I sometimes find it really helpful to substitute the nicotine gum with a sugar-free gum or some sort of sugar-free sweet, just to give them some of that behavioural replacement. And you're going to need to monitor urges to smoke again, and if that gets to the stage where they're going to go back to smoking, put them back on the nicotine gum again. Okay, so just keep them at the lowest possible dose that you can. And then you might have to try that last step again. So now you've got people hopefully off the oral NRT products and on the full strength patches, then you can just reduce the patch strength over time. Again, take this on a case-by-case basis. I think over 4 to 6 weeks again is reasonable to do this. So essentially it's, as they're coming off the nicotine from their oral product, you're increasing the dose via patches, and then at the end, you can reduce the patch dose and aim to stop patches completely as well. There has been one study that's used Champix to help get people off long-term NRT use. Now, this is off-label, and in New Zealand, the current special authority wouldn't allow us to do this. But this particular study that was conducted in Denmark took 139 ex-smokers who were all long-term NRT users, and they randomized them to either 12 weeks of Champix or placebo, and they followed them up for a year. Now, Champix wasn't perfect in helping people stop NRT use. This is NRT abstinence rates. Kind of strange, I know, but you can see there at 12 weeks, 64% of those on Champix, I'm not quite sure what happened to my key here, but the blue bars are Champix. So 64% of those using Champix stopped long-term NRT use, and 40% on placebo stopped NRT use. This goes to show the power of placebo here. That difference was significant. At a year, so no NRT use for a whole year, we're down to 42% for Champix and 36% for placebo. So it's possible. It is possible to help people stop their long-term NRT use. There will be some, though, that will really struggle and just won't manage to do it. So that's all I have for now. I'll stop the sharing and I'll unmute you all. Any questions? Oh yeah, thanks. Thanks for typing those things in. So the first one is, any ideas for those who can't or won't use patches and are addicted to gum? Yeah, a little more difficult. You could try switching them to another product instead of using the patch, but then there is a chance, of course, that our transfer their dependence to the other product. The best way, if they won't use patches, would probably be to substitute a sugar-free gum in there and just get them to reduce their consumption over time. Another question. Our chemists are going to be able to offer NRT very soon to clients, both new and existing. This will be hard to monitor. And indeed it will. And I still think that although pharmacists, it's great that they'll be able to open up the market to subsidised NRT, providing subsidised NRT, you do have an obligation to monitor long-term use. So that would be good practice to do. I suspect that there are more long-term NRT users out there and we just don't see them. I don't know what the pharmacist scheme will do. Maybe we'll see less of them because people will be able to just go into their pharmacy and pick them up and carry on using NRT in that way. But yeah, I think whoever wrote that question, Terry C, I mean, very good question. And I think that ideally we'd want to make sure that people are monitored. Any other questions? Maybe not just related to this, but to nicotine in general. Yeah, it will be possible to have a copy of the presentation. What we'll do, probably not until next week, until we find exactly where we'll put it. But I've recorded both this presentation and we'll put a copy of the slides, so you'll be able to access those. Will Quitline use this protocol? Quitline do know about this protocol, so they could use this. It does involve much more contact and careful monitoring. It's not something you can do easily with saying to someone, "Oh, here, do this 4-step process and good luck." It involves, following people up, getting them in, monitoring their urges to smoke, especially, and so. It may be a better approach for those that want to come off NRT to use the stop smoking services, just because we've got that closer relationship. Angela, yes, you're right. Quitline are now only providing quit cards for a limited period of time. In the past, Quitline had a whole host of people that were using NRT long-term for years, kind of unchecked, I suppose. And so they've changed their protocols to make sure that you know, there is an understanding that there is a limited time course, but they will look at it on an individual case-by-case basis as well.
Where are you going now? Oh, I'll drop you off again on the other side right now. Okay?
Some practitioners are concerned that they are funded to work only with smokers, and some of these long-term users are not enrolled. How can they capture that work? I realise it won't be big numbers, but it should be clear that this is part of the role. Jan, look, you're absolutely right, and I think we've had these conversations before. You're not going to include these in your enrolled numbers, but when you do your narrative reporting back to the ministry, you should include these other things, just like you should include your 12-week success rates or your 12-month success rates or whatever else you're seeing in the program. I know we get really bogged down by just focusing on the 4-week outcomes, but that's just one window measurement. So if you are seeing these long-term NRT users, make sure that you just put it in your narrative report saying you're supporting 10 people to reduce NRT. That would be useful for the ministry to know as well. Question, many mental health complaints have been irritated by the patches. Do the patches interact with antipsychotics? They don't. Patches are irritating. It may be that people with mental illness may be just more sensitive to a whole lot of symptoms. They're certainly more sensitive to tobacco withdrawal, so maybe more aware of it. But just use your common sense advice, of course, to make sure they're rotating the site of patches each day. Some people using Quitline cannot access face-to-face services. Should we do this over the phone and include in the narrative?
No.
I'm
not quite sure. I completely understand that question. Is that from you, Sarah?
Yeah, so we've had someone who was kicked out of Quitline, couldn't see us for face-to-face support, and ended up non-engaging, saying that it was all just too hard. And yeah, so she wasn't supported to reduce her NRT long-term use. She was very unhappy with the process that had, sort of gone through.
Right. Okay. Look, I think in those situations where, and I'm just going to mute you all. You can mute yourself. You can unmute yourselves when you want to talk. I think when you've got people that are referred to you and they say to you, "Look, I've come from Quitline. I really want to get off NRT, but I can't come in to see you face to face." Then absolutely do whatever you can over the phone to help them do that. And it's all about providing some ongoing monitoring for these people to ensure that they don't relapse to smoking. I think that's your key goal, is to protect them from going back to smoking. We don't want that happening at all. Anything else?
Hi, Hayden.
Hi.
Hey, Hayden. I think I just want to throw this in there. I think that it's good to know that not one size fits all. Everybody's different, and it is a case by case thing with clients in regards to prescribing NRT and what suits them. I mean, Yeah, so skin irritation, everybody's different again. You know, you might get one person where there's no skin irritation, and then there might be several others that do have that problem. I had one person who wore them on the leg, but around the arm, you know, above the waist, there was skin irritation, but around the legs there wasn't. You know,
yeah,
so
Glenn, that's a good point. And you know, often the skin on our legs is, in some parts at least, is a little bit more robust than the skin on our higher up. So yeah, finding it doesn't really matter where you put the patches. So changing those sites can be really useful. So
yeah.
Another question: when we say long-term nicotine use, what timeline do we actually mean? Well, it's probably anything over 3 to 6 months. So especially when you've got people getting to a year, that would definitely be long-term NRT use. But I bet you all know some people out there that have been used NRT for many, many more years than that. There are cases worldwide of people that started using nicotine gum 40 years ago and are still using it. So they've just transferred their dependence to that. Okay.
Hi, Robbie. Thanks for sharing your knowledge. Hayden. Hi, Hayden. Sorry, Hayden. Thanks for sharing your knowledge. I've got to go and see a client. Thanks
okay, very good.
Bye.
That's good. So thanks very much for everyone for joining. We will make these available. We're going to do these monthly. So it will be the first Monday of every month, unless I've got something where I'm not going to be here. If you've got topics that you really want to see discussed, then email those through to us. That would be great. And I know there's a range of different things that you'd like. So thanks. High dose NRT for a topic. Well, if you want to do high dose NRT, we can definitely do that next month. There's a little bit of new data, including some data that we've just finished with colleagues. So we'll do that. Pregnancy, yes, good idea, especially there's been some comments and perhaps some angst again about using nicotine in pregnancy. So we'll add those in. Casino, I'll pass that message on to Edward about GBT. But thanks very much. Great to talk to you all. Hope you found this interesting. I'm very happy to have your feedback as well. And have a great day and a great week. Ka kite.